The rain hammered the cracked asphalt of Meridian Street like bullets from heaven, each drop exploding against the oil-stained pavement where Elena Vasquez knelt beside a symphony of broken metal and shattered dreams. Her father's garage, Vasquez Auto Repair, squatted defiantly between a boutique coffee shop charging $12 for lattes and a yoga studio where trust fund babies bent themselves into pretzels while debating the authenticity of their spiritual journeys. Elena's calloused fingers traced the undercarriage of Mrs. Rodriguez's ancient Honda Civic, feeling for the source of the mysterious rattle that had been keeping the elderly woman awake at night. The fluorescent lights above flickered like dying stars, casting harsh shadows across tools that had been passed down through 3 generations of Vasquez men, and now one woman who refused to let their legacy die with the neighborhood's dignity. "Transmission mount," she murmured to herself, Spanish and English mixing in her thoughts, like oil and water that somehow still managed to power the same engine. Her father had taught her that every car spoke its own language of vibrations, each mechanical voice telling stories of neglect, love, desperation, and hope. This Honda whispered of a grandmother who needed it to last just 6 more months until her granddaughter graduated nursing school. Elena's phone buzzed against her hip. Another bill collector, no doubt. Diego's medical expenses had grown like a tumor, consuming every dollar she earned from her 3 jobs: mechanic by day, bookkeeper for the corner market by evening, and freelance programming consultant by night. The irony wasn't lost on her that she could debug complex software systems for Fortune 500 companies remotely while lying under cars that were older than the internet. But pride was a luxury her family couldn't afford. The familiar rumble of an expensive engine cut through the rain's percussion, growing louder as it approached. Elena didn't need to look up to know it was something exotic. The sound signature was too clean, too perfectly tuned, like a classical orchestra compared to the blues and jazz of the working-class vehicles she usually treated. The engine note carried that particular arrogance of Italian engineering married to unlimited money. Ferrari? Definitely Ferrari. Probably a 488 Spider based on the V8's distinctive snarl. The engine coughed once, twice, then died with a mechanical sigh that Elena's trained ear recognized immediately. Fuel injection system failure, most likely a sensor cascade that had confused the car's computer into thinking it was drowning when it was actually starving. She slid out from under the Honda, her coveralls bearing abstract art created by years of automotive surgery. Through the open bay door, she watched as a figure emerged from what was indeed a gleaming red Ferrari 488 Spider. A $250,000 statement piece that now sat as useless as a paperweight on the rain-soaked street. Marcus Kellerman stepped out like he was exiting a spaceship that had landed in a primitive world. Even in the downpour, his Armani suit somehow remained pristine, as if the rain itself was too intimidated to touch him. His Italian leather shoes, Elena estimated at least $1,000 based on the way they reflected the neon signs, stepped carefully around puddles that probably cost less than his morning coffee. Elena had seen his face before, plastered across business magazines and TED Talk promotional materials. The visionary who democratized innovation, according to Forbes. The philanthropist CEO lifting America's forgotten communities, claimed Harvard Business Review. In person, he carried himself with the particular swagger of new money, trying to cosplay old money sophistication. Marcus approached the garage like a safari tourist, observing natives, his pale blue eyes scanning the organized chaos of Elena's workspace with barely concealed disgust. He pulled out his phone, the latest iPhone Pro Max, naturally, and began barking orders to what Elena assumed was his assistant. "Yes, I need the Bentley brought around immediately. The Ferrari has some sort of mechanical situation." He pronounced the last word like it was a personal insult. "How long? 45 minutes? That's unacceptable. I have a city planning committee meeting at 8. Elena wiped her hands on a shop rag and approached slowly, studying Marcus the way she studied a complex engine problem. Every detail mattered. The way he held himself, the micro-expressions that revealed his true thoughts beneath the practiced public persona, the unconscious tells that would later prove crucial. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying just enough volume to cut through his phone conversation. "Your car? Having trouble?" Marcus turned toward her with the expression of a man who had just been addressed by a piece of furniture that had suddenly developed speech. His eyes tracked over her appearance, grease-stained coveralls, steel-toed boots, the practical ponytail held in place by what looked like an ordinary hairpin, but was actually her father's final gift to her. "I'm sorry. Are you the manager here?" The pause before manager carried volumes of assumption about what a woman in coveralls could possibly know about automobiles, especially exotic ones. "Owner, actually," Elena replied, her tone remaining level despite the familiar sting of condescension. "Elena Vasquez, I can take a look at your Ferrari if you'd like. Sounds like a fuel injection issue, probably a cascading sensor failure confusing the ECU. Marcus blinked twice, processing this information like a computer struggling with unexpected data input. "You think you can diagnose a Ferrari 488 Spider just by listening to it? I don't think anything. I know exactly what's wrong with it." Elena stepped closer, noting how Marcus instinctively backed away, as if competence might be contagious. 15 minutes, $10, and I'll have you back on the road." The laugh that escaped Marcus Kellerman was the sound of a man who found the very concept of competence in unexpected packages to be personally offensive. $10? Do you have any idea how much this car costs? "About $275,000 depending on options," Elena replied without hesitation. "But expensive and complicated aren't the same thing. Your fuel rail pressure sensor is sending bad data to the ECU, which is shutting down the injectors to protect the engine. Classic fail-safe behavior. Takes 5 minutes to reset, 10 if I'm being careful." Marcus's expression shifted from amusement to something approaching anger. In his world, knowledge was supposed to correlate with privilege. The idea that someone in coveralls could understand his expensive toy better than he did violated fundamental assumptions about how the universe was supposed to work. "Listen, miss," he paused, clearly having forgotten her name already. "I'm sure you're very good at changing oil and rotating tires, but this is a precision instrument. It requires specialized diagnostic equipment worth more than this entire establishment." Elena felt the familiar burn of being underestimated, a sensation she'd grown accustomed to since childhood. It was the same look she'd gotten from MIT classmates who assumed her scholarship was charity, from corporate headhunters who couldn't believe her resume, from every man who walked into her garage expecting to speak to the real mechanic. "I could fix it with a hairpin," she said quietly, her hand moving unconsciously to the titanium alloy pin that held her dark hair in place. "But I understand if you'd rather wait for your other car. Rain's supposed to keep up for another hour or two." The suggestion that he might be inconvenienced, that he might have to wait like a common person, struck Marcus like a physical blow. His carefully maintained public image as a self-made innovator couldn't accommodate the idea of being rescued by a small-town mechanic, especially one who clearly belonged to the demographic he gave speeches about lifting up rather than learning from. "A hairpin," he repeated, his voice dripping with the kind of contempt usually reserved for people who believed the earth was flat. "You're going to fix a $250,000 Ferrari with a hairpin." "If you want me to," Elena replied, pulling the pin from her hair and letting her dark waves fall around her shoulders. In the fluorescent light, the hairpin looked ordinary, unremarkable, like 1,000 others sold in drugstores across America. "But it's still going to cost you $10. Marcus stared at the simple piece of metal in her hand, then at her face, then back at his silent Ferrari. The rain continued its relentless assault on the street, turning the collision of their two worlds into something cinematic, the sterile perfection of his wealth against the authentic chaos of her workspace. "This is absurd," he muttered, pulling out his phone again. "I'm calling a real service center." Elena shrugged and turned back toward the Honda, dismissing him with the kind of casual indifference that Marcus Kellerman hadn't experienced since he was poor. In his world, people fought for his attention, competed for his approval, hung on his every word. Being ignored was more insulting than being insulted. "Your funeral," Elena said, sliding back under Mrs. Rodriguez's car. "But that nearest Ferrari dealership is 40 miles away, and they'll want to tow it. That's going to run you at least 500 just to get it there. Probably another 800 for the same repair I'd do for 10. She began working on the Honda's transmission mount, her movements precise and economical. Every bolt turn was deliberate, every adjustment calculated. This was her element, the place where all of her father's training, all of her MIT education, and all of her hard-won experience converged into something approaching artistry. Marcus stood in the rain for a long moment, phone in hand, watching this woman work with a level of focused competence that his expensive consultants rarely demonstrated. The sound of her tools mixing with the rain created a rhythm that was almost hypnotic, a blue-collar symphony that spoke of real work rather than performative innovation. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. The City Planning Committee meeting, the one where he would present his charitable plan to redevelop this exact neighborhood, had been moved up by 30 minutes. Time was becoming a luxury he couldn't afford, even with unlimited money. Elena's voice drifted from under the Honda, casual as commenting on the weather. "Offer stands for another 5 minutes. After that, I've got other work to do. Like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of justice served cold and calmer, delivered with precision. You won't believe what happens when arrogance meets competence." The timer had started ticking, though Marcus Kellerman didn't yet realize he was racing against more than just the clock. In his pocket, his phone continued buzzing with the urgent demands of a life built on other people's stolen dreams. Under the Honda, Elena Vasquez continued her work, one hand on her tools and one hand on destiny, while the hairpin that would change everything lay innocently on her workbench, waiting for its moment to rewrite history. 3 months earlier, Elena had been sitting in Rosa Martinez's cluttered home office, surrounded by towers of legal documents that reached toward the ceiling like paper skyscrapers built from 15 years of patient investigation. The late afternoon sun filtered through dusty Venetian blinds, casting prison bar shadows across photographs that told the story of systematic corporate theft spanning decades. "Your father was brilliant, mija," Rosa had whispered, her weathered fingers tracing the edges of patent applications that bore Eduardo Vasquez's signature. But he trusted the wrong people. Elena had seen these documents before, fragments of her father's life's work scattered across Rosa's dining room table like pieces of a puzzle that had taken years to assemble. Original blueprints for the revolutionary engine management system that had made Marcus Kellerman billions. Prototype designs for hybrid technology that wouldn't become mainstream for another decade. Software algorithms that could optimize fuel efficiency in ways the automotive industry was still trying to understand. "He came to me in 2010, Rosa continued, her voice carrying the weight of old guilt. "Said someone at Kellerman Technologies was asking too many questions about his consulting work. He was paranoid, thought they were trying to steal his designs." The irony burned like acid in Elena's chest. Her father's paranoia hadn't been paranoia at all. It had been perfect clarity about the nature of corporate predators like Marcus Kellerman. Eduardo Vasquez had seen the trap being set, had tried to warn everyone who would listen, and had been dismissed as a bitter man who couldn't accept that his ideas weren't good enough for the big leagues. "Show me everything," Elena had said that day, settling into the investigation that would consume every spare moment of the next 3 months. The evidence was overwhelming once Rosa laid it out in chronological order. Marcus Kellerman hadn't built his empire through innovation. He'd built it through sophisticated intellectual property theft. The pattern was always the same. Identify brilliant inventors working in isolation, offer them consulting contracts with Kellerman Technologies, slowly extract their ideas through collaborative development sessions, then tie them up in legal battles they couldn't afford to fight. Eduardo Vasquez had been victim number 17, according to Rosa's meticulous records. A gifted engineer who'd spent his life savings developing hybrid engine technology in his garage, believing that his innovations could help save the environment while creating good jobs for his community. Marcus had dangled a partnership deal, complete with promises of shared profits and recognition, right up until the moment Eduardo's patents were mysteriously rejected due to prior art that consisted of his own stolen work. "Your father fought for 2 years," Rosa had explained, showing Elena court documents stained with coffee rings and tears. "Spent everything he had on legal fees. I tried to help, but Kellerman's lawyers buried us in paperwork. They knew we couldn't afford to keep fighting." Elena had studied surveillance photographs that Rosa had commissioned, Marcus Kellerman speaking at technology conferences, presenting his innovations to crowds of venture capitalists and industry leaders. In every photo, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who genuinely believed his own lies, who had convinced himself that stealing ideas from desperate inventors was simply good business. "The suicide note?" Elena had finally asked, dreading the answer she knew was coming. Rosa had handed her a photocopy of her father's final words, written in the careful engineer's handwriting that Elena remembered from childhood homework help. "I failed to protect my work. I failed to protect my family. Maybe now Elena can have a life without my failures holding her back." But Eduardo Vasquez had been more paranoid and more brilliant than even Rosa had realized. The hairpin had come with a letter, delivered to Elena 2 weeks after the funeral by a courier who'd been paid in advance to wait exactly 1 year before making the delivery. Her father's final gift had seemed like a simple keepsake at first, a titanium alloy hair accessory he'd crafted in his workshop, practical and beautiful in the way that only functional engineering could be. It wasn't until Elena had absent-mindedly plugged it into her laptop's USB port, the pin doubled as a connector when properly configured, that she discovered her father's true legacy. The hairpin contained terabytes of data, complete development records for every project he'd worked on, recordings of meetings with Marcus Kellerman's representatives, and most damning of all, the original source code for the engine management system that had become the cornerstone of Kellerman Technologies' success. Her father hadn't just been paranoid, he'd been preparing for war. The recordings were devastating. Marcus Kellerman's voice, crystal clear through encrypted audio files, casually discussing how to acquire Eduardo's work without paying fair compensation. Phone calls where he laughed about that old Mexican who thought his patents were worth millions. Email chains where Kellerman's legal team strategized about burying Eduardo in litigation until he gave up or died trying. "The beauty of dealing with these small-time inventors," Marcus had said in one particularly damning recording, "is that they're so grateful for any attention from a real company, they'll sign anything. By the time they realize what happened, we own everything, and they own nothing." Elena had spent weeks verifying every piece of evidence, cross-referencing patent filings with her father's original designs, matching timestamps on the recordings with public statements Marcus had made about his breakthrough innovations. The case was airtight. Marcus Kellerman had built his empire on systematic theft, and Eduardo Vasquez had documented every crime. But Rosa's investigation had revealed an even darker truth. Marcus hadn't just stolen from Elena's father. He'd been running the same scam for over a decade, targeting inventors across the country who lacked the resources to fight back. Small-town mechanics with revolutionary ideas about electric vehicle charging, retired engineers with breakthrough battery technology, college students with innovative software solutions who needed internship credits more than they needed legal protection. 43 inventors that I can prove, Rosa had told her during one of their late-night strategy sessions. Probably twice that many who were too ashamed or too broken to come forward. He's built a machine that turns innovation into personal wealth while destroying the lives of the people who actually create things. The most sickening discovery had come when Elena cross-referenced Marcus's public speeches about lifting up communities with the locations where he'd stolen ideas. He wasn't just a thief, he was a predator who specifically targeted inventors from disadvantaged backgrounds, people who were desperate enough to trust his promises and vulnerable enough to be crushed when those promises turned into lawsuits. Elena had realized that confronting Marcus directly would be pointless. Men like him didn't respond to moral arguments or emotional appeals. They only understood power, and specifically the power to destroy their carefully constructed public images. The key wasn't proving he was a criminal, it was proving it in a way that would cost him everything he valued most. "We need to catch him in the act," Elena had concluded during their final planning session. "Not just show what he did 15 years ago, but demonstrate that he's still the same predator now. Make him reveal his true nature in front of witnesses who matter." The plan they'd developed was elegant in its simplicity. Marcus Kellerman drove the same route to work every morning, a parade route through gentrifying neighborhoods designed to showcase his success to the people he was systematically displacing. His Ferrari was equipped with the latest version of the engine management system based on Eduardo's stolen patents, technology that Elena understood better than anyone else alive, including Marcus himself. "All we need is the right opportunity," Rosa had said, studying traffic patterns and city planning documents that showed Marcus's involvement in neighborhood redevelopment projects. One moment where his arrogance overrides his common sense. Elena had spent the next month preparing, studying every technical specification of Marcus's Ferrari, memorizing every line of her father's code that still ran in its systems. She'd practiced the repair procedure dozens of times, timing herself until she could execute it perfectly in under 5 minutes. The hairpin had been modified slightly, still functional as both a hair accessory and a data storage device, but now also capable of interfacing directly with automotive diagnostic ports that most people didn't even know existed. The rain had been an unexpected gift, creating the perfect conditions for a mechanical failure that would strand Marcus exactly where Elena needed him to be. Modern Ferraris were notoriously sensitive to moisture, and Elena had been monitoring weather patterns for weeks, waiting for the right combination of humidity and electrical interference that would trigger the cascade failure she'd predicted. When Marcus's Ferrari had coughed and died outside her garage, Elena had felt the same focused calm that always preceded her most complex repairs. Every variable was aligned, every piece of evidence was in place, and Rosa was waiting in her office with legal documents that would destroy Marcus Kellerman's life as thoroughly as he'd destroyed Eduardo Vasquez's. The hardest part had been maintaining her composure during Marcus's casual dismissal of her abilities. Every condescending word, every assumption about her intelligence based on her appearance, every moment when he looked at her like she was part of the scenery rather than a human being with feelings and capabilities, it all echoed her father's final months when Marcus's legal team had systematically destroyed his confidence and his will to fight. But Eduardo Vasquez had raised his daughter to be stronger than her enemies, smarter than her circumstances, and more patient than anyone who underestimated her could possibly imagine. Elena had learned to turn condescension into fuel, to let every slight sharpen her focus rather than cloud her judgment. Standing in her garage, watching Marcus Kellerman struggle with the concept that a woman in coveralls might know more about his expensive toy than he did, Elena felt her father's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder. The trap was set, the evidence was ready, and Marcus was about to make the same mistake that had doomed every bully who'd ever confused cruelty with strength. He was about to underestimate Elena Vasquez. What caught your attention the most in this story so far? Was it Marcus's systematic theft from dozens of inventors, or the way he specifically targeted vulnerable people who couldn't fight back? Comment below and let us know what made you most indignant about this corporate predator's methods. The rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean, while Elena prepared to expose 15 years of accumulated dirt. In less than 10 minutes, Marcus Kellerman would be forced to make a choice that would change both their lives forever. And he still had no idea that the woman offering to fix his car with a hairpin was the daughter of the man he'd destroyed. Justice, Elena had learned, was a dish best served with absolute precision and perfect timing. Marcus Kellerman stood in the rain for exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Elena knew, because she'd been counting, the way her father had taught her to count timing intervals when diagnosing engine problems. Precision mattered in both mechanical work and psychological warfare. "Fine," Marcus said finally, the word escaping like steam from a pressure valve. "But I want to be clear that this is against my better judgment. If you damage anything at all, you'll be hearing from my attorneys." Elena slid out from under the Honda, her movements deliberately unhurried despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. This was the moment Rosa had prepared her for, when 15 years of patient investigation would finally bear fruit. But it had to look natural, unrehearsed, like a simple business transaction between a stranded motorist and a helpful mechanic. "I'll need you to pop the hood and turn the key to the accessory position," Elena said, walking toward the Ferrari with her father's hairpin gleaming in her palm. "The diagnostic port is behind the steering wheel. I'll need to access the car's computer system." Marcus followed her to his disabled supercar, his Italian leather shoes squelching through puddles that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Elena noticed how he positioned himself slightly behind and to the right, the unconscious posture of someone who wanted to supervise without appearing to doubt her competence. It was the same way wealthy men had watched her father work, back when Eduardo still believed that skill and honesty were enough to protect him from predators. "You're saying you can reprogram a Ferrari's computer with a hairpin," Marcus said, his tone carrying the particular skepticism of a man who'd built his fortune by convincing others that simple solutions were impossible. "That's like saying you can perform brain surgery with a spoon." Elena knelt beside the driver's seat, studying the interior with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent her life understanding how machines thought. The Ferrari's cabin was a study in expensive minimalism. Carbon fiber and leather arranged with the kind of aesthetic precision that only unlimited money could buy. But underneath the luxury, it was still just a computer on wheels, and computers spoke a language Elena had been fluent in since childhood. "Not reprogram," she corrected, locating the diagnostic port hidden behind a small panel near the steering column. "Just reset the error cascade that's confusing the fuel injection system. Your car thinks it's drowning when it's actually starving." The hairpin slid into the port with a soft click that seemed to echo through the rain-soaked street. Elena felt the familiar thrill of connecting to a machine's nervous system, the moment when mechanical sympathy became technological telepathy. Her father's code was still there, embedded in the Ferrari's operating system like DNA in a living cell, proof of his genius stolen and repackaged as Marcus Kellerman's innovation. "How do you know so much about Ferrari diagnostics?" Marcus asked, genuine curiosity creeping into his voice for the first time. "This isn't exactly standard auto shop territory." Elena's fingers moved across the hairpin's hidden interface, navigating through system menus that Marcus couldn't see. Each command brought her deeper into the car's electronic brain, past layers of security that her father had designed to protect his work from exactly the kind of theft that had ultimately destroyed him. "My father was an engineer," Elena said quietly, accessing the fuel system's error logs. "He taught me that every machine has a story to tell, if you know how to listen." Duh. The Ferrari's computer began displaying its recent history, a cascade of sensor readings and error codes that painted a perfect picture of the humidity-induced failure Elena had predicted. But buried in the diagnostic data was something far more valuable: the original source code signatures that proved Eduardo Vasquez's authorship of the engine management system. Vasquez, Marcus repeated thoughtfully, as if the name carried some half-remembered significance. That's interesting. I used to work with an engineer named Vasquez years ago. Brilliant man, very creative. Eduardo, I think his name was. Elena's hands stilled on the hairpin interface. This was the moment Rosa had warned her about, when Marcus would either recognize the connection and panic, or reveal just how thoroughly he'd compartmentalized his crimes. Sociopaths, Rosa had explained, often genuinely forgot their victims' names, while remembering their stolen work with perfect clarity. "What happened to him?" Elena asked, her voice carefully neutral despite the rage building in her chest. Marcus shrugged with the casual indifference of a man discussing yesterday's weather. "Oh, you know how it is with these small-time inventors. They have one good idea, think it's worth millions, then get bitter when the market doesn't agree. Eduardo had some interesting concepts, but he could never scale them up for real-world applications. Last I heard, he'd given up engineering altogether." The lie was so casual, so perfectly delivered, that Elena almost admired its craftsmanship. Marcus had convinced himself that stealing Eduardo's work was simply good business, that transforming another man's life's work into personal wealth was just efficient resource allocation. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain that worldview was almost impressive in its completeness. "That's sad," Elena said, continuing her work on the Ferrari's systems while documenting every word for Rosa's legal team. "What happened to his ideas?" "Well, that's the beauty of innovation in a free market," Marcus replied, warming to one of his favorite topics. "Good ideas don't die just because their original creators can't execute them properly. My team at Kellerman Technologies was able to take some of Eduardo's rough concepts and develop them into practical, scalable solutions. We turned his garage-level tinkering into technology that's improved millions of lives." Elena accessed the Ferrari's historical data logs, downloading every piece of information that proved her father's authorship of the stolen technology. The hairpin was functioning exactly as Eduardo had designed it, not just as a repair tool, but as a digital skeleton key that could unlock the truth about Marcus Kellerman's empire. "So you're saying you bought his patents?" Elena asked innocently. Marcus's laugh was the sound of a man who found the concept of fair compensation personally amusing. "Patents. Elena, was it? Let me explain how the real world works. Eduardo was a consultant for my company. When you're paid to develop technology for someone else, that someone else owns the results, it's basic contract law." The Ferrari's computer chirped softly as Elena completed the reset sequence, its fuel injection system coming back online with mechanical precision. But she wasn't finished with the diagnostic process, not when Marcus was so helpfully documenting his own criminality with every word. "But what if someone developed the technology before they worked for you?" Elena pressed, pulling up patent filing dates that showed Eduardo's applications predating his consulting contract by 2 years. "Wouldn't that change things legally?" Marcus's expression shifted slightly, a micro-expression of annoyance that suggested he'd had this conversation before with attorneys and accountants who'd raised similar concerns. "That's why companies like mine have legal departments, Elena, to handle technicalities that might confuse people without business experience." Elena felt her father's rage flowing through her like electricity through copper wire, but she channeled it into laser-focused precision. Marcus Kellerman was confessing to systematic fraud with the casual confidence of a man who'd never faced consequences for his actions. Every word was being recorded by the hairpin's hidden audio capture system, building an evidence file that would make Rosa's existing case absolutely bulletproof. "The car should start now," Elena announced, disconnecting the hairpin and rising to her feet. "Try turning it over." Marcus slid into the Ferrari's driver's seat, his movements carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who just had his worldview confirmed by a subordinate's successful completion of assigned tasks. The engine roared to life with the mechanical poetry of Italian engineering, its V8 symphony drowning out the rain's percussion for a moment of automotive perfection. "Impressive," Marcus admitted, revving the engine to hear its healthy purr. "I have to say, I'm surprised. You actually knew what you were doing." Elena pocketed the hairpin, feeling its weight like a loaded weapon concealed in plain sight. $10, like I promised." Marcus reached for his wallet, extracting a crisp $100 bill with the casual gesture of someone for whom money had lost all meaning except as a tool for demonstrating superiority. "Keep the change. Consider it a tip for surprising me." The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife, the tone of a man throwing coins to an organ grinder's monkey. Elena felt the familiar burn of being patronized, but this time it was fuel rather than poison. Marcus Kellerman had just paid her $100 to document his confession to criminal fraud. "Actually," Elena said, studying the bill like she'd never seen currency before, "I prefer exact change. $10 is what I quoted. $10 is what I'll take." Marcus blinked in confusion, his brain struggling to process the concept of someone refusing his generous overpayment. In his world, everyone had a price, and that price was always higher than their stated worth. The idea that someone might prefer fair compensation to exploitative charity violated fundamental assumptions about human nature. "I'm trying to tip you," Marcus explained slowly, as if Elena might be suffering from some sort of cognitive impairment. "For good service, it's how business works." "I know how business works," Elena replied, handing back the 100 and extending her palm for proper payment. "My father taught me that honest work deserves honest pay, nothing more, nothing less." The word "father" seemed to trigger something in Marcus's expression, a flicker of recognition that he quickly suppressed. Elena watched his face carefully, cataloguing every micro-expression for later analysis. Sociopaths were often skilled at hiding their emotions, but they struggled with unexpected stimuli that forced them to access buried memories. "Your father sounds like a smart man," Marcus said, fishing a $10 bill from his wallet with visible reluctance. "Though, in my experience, that kind of rigid thinking can limit opportunities for advancement." Elena accepted the exact payment with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "He always said that character was worth more than opportunity. Turns out, he was right about a lot of things." Marcus started to respond, then seemed to think better of it. He was already running late for his city planning committee meeting, the same meeting where he would present his charitable proposal to redevelop Elena's neighborhood, destroying dozens of small businesses like her garage to make room for luxury condos and boutique shopping centers. "Well, thank you for the assistance," Marcus said, putting the Ferrari in gear. "Maybe I'll recommend your shop to friends who need work done on their less expensive vehicles." The insult was casual, automatic, delivered with the unconscious cruelty of someone who'd never learned to see other people as fully human. Elena watched him prepare to drive away, knowing that in approximately 6 hours, Rosa would be filing legal papers that would turn Marcus Kellerman's world into a smoking crater. "Mr. Kellerman," Elena called out just as he was about to pull away. "One more thing." Marcus paused, his window already halfway up against the rain. "Yes? When you present that engine management technology at conferences, do you ever think about the person who actually invented it?" The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Marcus's expression went completely blank for a moment, his brain clearly working to process this unexpected query from someone who should have remained safely categorized as irrelevant service provider. "I'm not sure what you mean," Marcus said finally, his voice carrying a note of caution that hadn't been there before. Elena stepped closer to the car, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Eduardo Vasquez, the engineer whose work built your fortune. Do you ever wonder what happened to his family after he killed himself? Like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories where arrogance meets its match. You won't want to miss what happens when Marcus realizes exactly who he's been talking to, The color drained from Marcus Kellerman's face like water from a broken tank, his carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal the frightened predator underneath. For the first time in 15 years, someone had spoken Eduardo Vasquez's name to his face and connected it to the fortune he'd built on stolen dreams. Elena stepped back from the Ferrari, her expression as calm as still water over deep currents. The trap had been sprung, the evidence was secured, and Marcus Kellerman had just realized that his past had finally caught up with him in the form of a woman with calloused hands, her father's eyes, and a hairpin full of justice waiting to be served. Marcus Kellerman's Ferrari sat idling in the rain like a wounded predator, its engine purring with mechanical perfection, while its owner's world began to collapse with the precision of a controlled demolition. Elena watched through the garage's open bay door as Marcus fumbled with his phone, his manicured fingers trembling slightly as he scrolled through contacts with the desperate urgency of a man realizing that his carefully constructed reality was about to be audited by people who wouldn't be. Impressed by his net worth. "Get me legal," Marcus barked into his phone, his voice carrying across the rain-soaked street. "Now! I don't care what time it is in Singapore, wake them up." Elena continued working on Mrs. Rodriguez's Honda, her movements calm and methodical, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Every tool placement was deliberate, every bolt turn calculated, because she knew that in approximately 30 minutes, her garage would become the center of a legal earthquake that had been building for 15 years. Rosa Martinez was already in motion. Elena could picture her mentor sitting in her cluttered home office, surrounded by towers of evidence and wearing the predatory smile of an attorney who'd spent decades waiting for the perfect moment to spring a trap. The phone call Rosa had been expecting would come any minute now. Marcus Kellerman's legal team demanding answers to questions they should have asked 15 years ago. Through the Ferrari's rain-streaked windshield, Elena could see Marcus pacing in his driver's seat, his phone pressed to his ear like a life preserver in stormy waters. His conversation was animated, punctuated by sharp gestures and what appeared to be increasingly desperate explanations. Elena didn't need to hear the words to understand the substance. Marcus was trying to contain a situation he didn't yet fully comprehend, mobilizing lawyers and crisis management specialists to fight an enemy he couldn't identify. The first sign that Marcus's world was about to change forever came in the form of a black sedan pulling up behind his Ferrari. The car moved with the unhurried precision of law enforcement, its occupants taking their time to observe the scene before making any moves. Elena recognized the methodical approach of federal agents, people who understood that rushing often destroyed evidence and that patience was the most powerful weapon in their arsenal. Two individuals emerged from the sedan, a woman in her early 40s wearing a conservative grey suit that managed to look both professional and intimidating, and a man who carried himself with the particular confidence of someone accustomed to making arrests that stuck. They approached Marcus's Ferrari from opposite sides, their movements coordinated with the kind of precision that came from years of practice. Elena felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the woman. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen, the prosecutor Rosa had been cultivating for over 2 years. Chen specialized in white-collar crime, particularly cases involving intellectual property theft, and she had a reputation for building cases so airtight that defendants usually plea bargained rather than face trial. Her presence meant that Rosa's evidence had been compelling enough to trigger a federal investigation. Marcus noticed the agents approximately 30 seconds after they'd positioned themselves around his vehicle, his peripheral vision finally registering that he was being observed by people who weren't impressed by expensive cars or designer suits. Elena watched his body language shift from agitated confidence to wary confusion as he ended his phone call and rolled down his window. "Mr. Marcus Kellerman?" Agent Chen's voice carried the kind of authority that made people instinctively straighten their posture. I'm Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen, and this is Special Agent Rodriguez from the FBI's Economic Crimes Unit. We'd like to speak with you about some irregularities in your patent filings. The word irregularities hit Marcus like a physical blow, his carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal the frightened criminal underneath. Elena could see his mind racing, trying to calculate how much these federal agents might know and which of his many crimes they might be investigating. "I'm sorry, I don't understand," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of practiced innocence that probably worked well with business journalists and venture capitalists. "Irregularities in what patent filings? I think there might be some confusion here." Agent Rodriguez stepped closer to the Ferrari's passenger side, his notepad already out and ready to document whatever lies Marcus was about to tell. "Sir, we have reason to believe that certain technologies patented by Kellerman Technologies between 2010 and 2012 may have been obtained through fraudulent means. We're hoping you can help us clear up some inconsistencies in the documentation." Elena marveled at the agent's careful language. They were giving Marcus enough rope to hang himself, inviting him to lie about crimes they could already prove, rather than immediately placing him under arrest. It was a masterclass in investigative technique, designed to build an even stronger case by documenting the defendant's willingness to perjure himself when confronted with evidence. Marcus glanced around nervously, his eyes settling briefly on Elena before snapping back to the federal agents. She could see him trying to process the connection between his casual conversation with a mechanic and the sudden appearance of law enforcement. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, but Marcus's narcissistic worldview made it difficult for him to accept that someone he'd dismissed as irrelevant might have orchestrated his downfall. "I think I should call my attorney," Marcus said finally, reaching for his phone with the kind of resigned certainty that suggested he'd been expecting this moment for years. "That's certainly your right," Agent Chen replied, her tone remaining professionally neutral. "But I should mention that we're not here to arrest you at this time. We're simply hoping for your voluntary cooperation in our investigation. Your attorney is welcome to join us, of course." The phrase "at this time" was loaded with implications that weren't lost on Marcus. Federal agents didn't conduct voluntary interviews unless they already had enough evidence to make arrests. They were offering him a chance to cooperate before the handcuffs came out. A final opportunity to minimize the damage by accepting responsibility rather than forcing them to prove every element of their case in court. Marcus's phone conversation with his attorney lasted exactly 3 minutes and 47 seconds. Elena could hear fragments of the discussion, urgent questions about federal jurisdiction, frantic demands for immediate legal representation, and increasingly desperate attempts to understand what specific crimes were being investigated. When Marcus finally ended the call, his face had gone pale beneath his expensive tan. "My attorney is en route," Marcus announced, trying to project confidence despite the tremor in his voice. "He'll be here in 20 minutes. I'm sure we can clear up whatever misunderstanding has occurred." Agent Chen nodded politely, making notes in her own pad, with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that suggested every word of this conversation would eventually be transcribed for a federal jury. "While we're waiting, would you mind if we asked you a few basic questions? Nothing that would require legal counsel. Just some clarification about your business relationships." Elena recognized the trap being set. Federal investigators were masters at asking basic questions that seemed innocuous, but were actually designed to establish patterns of deception that could be used as evidence of consciousness of guilt. Every lie Marcus told would be documented, every inconsistency catalogued, every attempt at misdirection preserved for later use in court. "I suppose that would be acceptable," Marcus said, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of remaining silent, but equally uncomfortable with the prospect of answering questions without legal protection. Agent Rodriguez consulted his notes with the deliberate pace of someone who had all day to destroy a criminal's carefully constructed facade. "Mr. Kellerman, are you familiar with an engineer named Eduardo Vasquez, who worked as a consultant for your company between 2009 and 2011? The question landed like a precision-guided missile, striking the exact vulnerable point that Rosa's investigation had identified. Elena watched Marcus's micro-expressions carefully, cataloguing every tell that revealed his consciousness of guilt. The slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible pause before responding, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel like a drowning man clinging to debris. Eduardo Vasquez, Marcus repeated slowly, as if trying to dredge up distant memories rather than suppressing recent lies. Yes, I believe we did some consulting work with him several years ago. He was a talented engineer, as I recall. Agent Chen stepped closer to the Ferrari, her presence somehow making the expensive car seem smaller and more vulnerable. According to our records, Mr. Vasquez filed several patent applications for hybrid engine technology between 2007 and 2009, approximately 2 years before his consulting contract with your company began. Are you familiar with those patents? Elena felt a surge of professional admiration for the federal agent's interrogation technique. They weren't asking Marcus whether he'd stolen Eduardo's work. They were asking him to explain the timeline that proved the theft had occurred. Every truthful answer would build evidence against him, while every lie would add additional charges of obstruction of justice. I'm not personally familiar with every patent filing that might have predated our consulting arrangement, Marcus said carefully, his voice carrying the practiced evasiveness of someone accustomed to answering hostile questions from business rivals and investigative journalists. Agent Rodriguez made another note, his pen scratching against paper with the sound of bureaucratic inevitability. Mr. Kellerman, would it surprise you to learn that several of the patents currently held by Kellerman Technologies contain identical technical specifications to the applications Mr. Vasquez filed before beginning work for your company? The trap was closing with mathematical precision, each question building on the last to create an inescapable logical framework. Elena could see Marcus calculating his options, trying to find a path through the investigation that didn't lead to federal prison. But Rosa and Agent Chen had spent 2 years building this case, examining every possible escape route and closing them off with evidence that couldn't be explained away. I think, Marcus said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, I really should wait for my attorney before answering any more questions. Like this video and subscribe to our channel to see what happens when 15 years of patient investigation finally pays off. You won't believe how thoroughly Marcus's empire is about to crumble. Agent Chen smiled with the cold satisfaction of a prosecutor who'd just heard a defendant invoke his right to remain silent in response to questions that any innocent person would answer without hesitation. Of course, Mr. Kellerman, we'll wait here with you until your legal representation arrives. Elena returned to her work on Mrs. Rodriguez's Honda, but her attention remained focused on the drama unfolding in the rain-soaked street. Marcus Kellerman sat trapped in his Ferrari like a fly in amber, surrounded by federal agents who possessed enough evidence to destroy everything he'd built on other people's stolen dreams. The timer had started counting down to justice, and Elena Vasquez held the hairpin that would unlock 15 years of accumulated truth. Marcus Kellerman's attorney arrived in a gunmetal grey Bentley that cost more than most people's houses, its pristine exterior cutting through the rain like a knife through silk. The man who emerged was everything Elena had expected from Rosa's descriptions of high-end white-collar defense lawyers: expensive suit, confident demeanor, and the kind of predatory intelligence that had built careers on keeping wealthy criminals out of prison. Victor Chen, no relation to the federal prosecutor despite the shared surname, had been Marcus's legal counsel for over a decade. Elena recognized him from newspaper photographs accompanying articles about landmark patent disputes and corporate acquisitions. He was the kind of attorney who charged $1,000 an hour and earned every penny by finding loopholes in laws that most people considered airtight. Gentleman, lady. Victor said, approaching the scene with the casual authority of someone accustomed to making federal investigations disappear through procedural technicalities. Victor Chen, representing Mr. Kellerman. I understand you have some questions about ancient history. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Victor's dismissive reference to her father's destruction as ancient history revealed the kind of casual cruelty that enabled systematic corporate crime. To him, Eduardo Vasquez wasn't a human being who'd been driven to suicide. He was just an old case file that could be buried with the right legal maneuvering. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen stepped forward, her expression carrying the kind of professional courtesy that masked absolute determination. Mr. Chen, thank you for joining us. We were just discussing some inconsistencies in patent filings that we hope your client can help us understand. Victor's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. I'm sure any inconsistencies are the result of clerical errors or misunderstandings about complex intellectual property law. Mr. Kellerman has always operated his business with complete legal compliance. Elena watched the interplay between the two legal professionals, recognizing it as the opening moves in a chess match where the stakes were measured in decades of federal prison time. Victor was probing for information about the scope of the investigation, while Agent Chen was carefully revealing just enough evidence to make it clear that this wasn't a fishing expedition. Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more appropriate, Victor suggested, glancing around at the rain-soaked street with obvious distaste. My client's offices would provide a more suitable environment for discussing sensitive business matters. Actually, Agent Rodriguez interjected, pulling a tablet from his briefcase, we have some audio evidence that we'd like Mr. Kellerman to review. It might help clarify his recollections about the consulting arrangement with Eduardo Vasquez. Elena felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the tablet model, the same high-end device that Rosa had used to organize the evidence contained in her father's hairpin. 15 years of patient investigation were about to be unleashed in digital format, and Marcus Kellerman was about to hear his own voice, confessing to crimes he thought were safely buried in the past. Victor's expression shifted slightly, the confident smile faltering as he realized that federal investigators didn't usually carry audio evidence to voluntary interviews unless they had something devastating to reveal. I'd like to review any evidence privately with my client before... These are recordings of business conversations, Agent Chen interrupted smoothly. Nothing privileged or protected, just Mr. Kellerman discussing his business practices with associates. The tablet screen flickered to life, displaying audio waveforms and timestamps that covered several years of Marcus's corporate communications. Elena could see her father's meticulous organization in the way the evidence was structured, each recording labeled with dates, participants, and subject matter that told a coherent story of systematic theft. Recording from October 15, 2010, Agent Rodriguez announced, touching the tablet's screen to begin playback. Phone conversation between Marcus Kellerman, an unnamed associate regarding acquisition strategy. Marcus's voice emerged from the tablet's speakers with crystal clarity, younger but carrying the same arrogant confidence that Elena had witnessed 30 minutes earlier. The beauty of dealing with these small-time inventors is that they're so grateful for any attention from a real company, they'll sign anything. By the time they realize what happened, we own everything, and they own nothing. The effect on Marcus was instantaneous and devastating. Elena watched color drain from his face as he heard his own words played back with perfect fidelity, his brain struggling to process how a private conversation from over a decade ago had been preserved and delivered to federal investigators. Victor placed a restraining hand on his client's arm, recognizing the signs of someone about to make statements that would be used against them in court. Marcus, don't say anything. But Agent Chen wasn't finished with the audio presentation. A recording from November 3, 2010, Phone conversation between Marcus Kellerman and legal counsel regarding Eduardo Vasquez's patent applications. Elena closed her eyes and listened to her father's death sentence being pronounced in Marcus's casual, confident voice. That old Mexican thinks his patents are worth millions. Our legal team needs to bury him in paperwork until he gives up or dies trying. Either way, we get the technology for pennies on the dollar. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the steady rhythm of rain against concrete and the distant hum of traffic. Elena opened her eyes to see Marcus staring at the tablet, as if it were a venomous snake that had materialized in front of him. "Where did you get those recordings?" Victor demanded, his professional composure cracking to reveal genuine alarm. "They appear to have been obtained without proper warrants, or the recordings were voluntarily provided by a witness who had legal access to them," Agent Chen replied calmly. Eduardo Vasquez documented his business communications as part of his normal engineering practice. The evidence was preserved and later provided to law enforcement by his surviving family members. Elena felt a surge of fierce pride in her father's paranoia-driven documentation. Eduardo had been so thoroughly destroyed by Marcus's theft that he'd lost faith in justice, but he'd still preserved every piece of evidence needed to eventually expose the truth. Even in his darkest moments, her father had continued fighting for a justice he thought he'd never live to see. The tablet continued its methodical destruction of Marcus Kellerman's carefully constructed lies. Recording after recording revealed the systematic nature of his theft, not just from Eduardo, but from dozens of inventors across multiple industries. Marcus's voice preserved in digital amber, confessing to crimes that had destroyed lives and stolen innovations worth billions of dollars. July 18, 2011, Agent Rodriguez announced. Phone conversation regarding Eduardo Vasquez's suicide and patent transfer procedures. Elena braced herself for this one, knowing it would be the most devastating evidence of all. Her father had been dead for less than 48 hours when this call was recorded, his body barely cold, while Marcus discussed how to profit from his destruction. Marcus's recorded voice carried no trace of guilt or remorse. "Well, that solves our Eduardo problem rather neatly. Legal says we can fast-track the remaining patent transfers now that there's no one left to contest them. Sometimes these situations resolve themselves in the most efficient way possible." Elena heard Victor Chen suck in a sharp breath, the sound of a defense attorney realizing that his client had just been revealed as something far worse than a simple patent thief. Marcus hadn't just stolen Eduardo's work. He'd celebrated his suicide as a business opportunity, treating a man's death as a convenient solution to a legal problem. "Jesus Christ, Marcus," Victor whispered, his professional detachment crumbling in the face of evidence that no amount of legal maneuvering could explain away. Marcus finally found his voice, though it emerged as little more than a croak. "Those recordings, they're taken out of context. You don't understand the business pressures we were facing, the competitive environment." Agent Chen closed the tablet with a soft click that sounded like the closing of a coffin. "Mr. Kellerman, based on these recordings and supporting documentary evidence, we have probable cause to believe you engaged in a pattern of intellectual property theft, mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud across state lines. These are federal crimes carrying significant prison sentences." Elena watched Marcus's world collapse in real time, his carefully maintained facade cracking like ice under pressure. The man who'd spent 15 years believing he was untouchable was finally being held accountable for crimes he'd committed with casual arrogance. "However," Agent Chen continued, "the U.S. Attorney's Office is prepared to discuss a cooperation agreement if you're willing to provide information about other potential victims and assist in recovering stolen intellectual property." Victor grabbed his client's arm again, his voice urgent with legal alarm. "Don't say another word, Marcus. We need to discuss this privately before you make any statements." But Marcus wasn't listening to his attorney's advice. Elena could see the narcissistic rage building behind his eyes, the fury of a man who couldn't accept that his victims had finally found a way to fight back. "You want to know about other victims?" Marcus snarled, his composure finally shattering completely. "I built my entire company on other people's ideas. That's how business works in the real world. You take good concepts from people too weak to protect them and turn them into actual success." Victor closed his eyes in despair, recognizing that his client had just confessed to multiple federal crimes in front of recording devices that would preserve every word for a jury to hear. Like this video and subscribe to our channel to watch a master manipulator destroy himself with his own arrogance. The next chapter reveals the full scope of Marcus's criminal empire. Elena felt her father's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder as she watched Marcus Kellerman's empire of stolen dreams finally crumble under the weight of truth. The hairpin in her pocket had unlocked more than just a Ferrari's computer system. It had unlocked 15 years of accumulated justice, delivered with the precision that only her father's engineering genius could have made possible. The trap had sprung with perfect timing, and Marcus Kellerman was about to learn that some debts could never be paid with money alone. The handcuffs clicked around Marcus Kellerman's wrists with the soft finality of a vault door closing, the sound cutting through the rain like a period at the end of a very long, very destructive sentence. Elena watched from her garage bay as the man who'd built an empire on her father's stolen genius was guided into the back of Agent Rodriguez's sedan, his expensive suit rumpled and his carefully maintained composure completely shattered. Victor Chen stood beside his client's abandoned Ferrari, his $1,000-an-hour confidence replaced by the shell-shocked expression of an attorney who'd just watched 15 years of legal strategy evaporate in 30 minutes of devastating evidence. He clutched his briefcase like a life preserver, his phone already pressed to his ear as he began the frantic process of damage control that would likely consume the next several years of his career. "Yes, I need the entire white-collar division mobilized immediately," Victor was saying, his voice carrying the desperate urgency of someone trying to stop a dam from breaking. "Federal charges, multiple counts. We're looking at RICO predicates if they can establish the pattern." Elena felt a profound sense of completion, watching Marcus's descent into the federal justice system. This moment had been inevitable since the day her father first suspected that his innovations were being stolen. But Eduardo Vasquez had died, believing that truth was no match for unlimited money and corrupt legal systems. Now his daughter was proving that patience, precision, and the right evidence could topple even the most seemingly untouchable criminals. Agent Chen approached Elena's garage with the measured pace of someone who understood that this moment marked the end of a long investigation and the beginning of what would likely be an even longer legal process. Her expression carried professional satisfaction, tempered by the knowledge that Marcus Kellerman's arrest was just the first domino in a chain reaction that would destroy dozens of careers and expose systematic corruption spanning multiple industries. "Ms. Vasquez," Agent Chen said, pulling out her badge and credentials for formal identification, "I'm Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen. I believe you've been working with Rosa Martinez on some matters related to this investigation." Elena wiped her hands on a shop rag, noting how surreal it felt to be conducting a federal investigation in her father's garage, while Mrs. Rodriguez's Honda waited patiently for its transmission mount replacement. The juxtaposition of ordinary mechanical work and extraordinary legal justice somehow felt appropriate. Both required patience, precision, and the ability to fix things that had been broken by careless or malicious hands. "Rosa said you might be coming by," Elena replied, reaching into her coveralls to extract the hairpin that had unlocked Marcus's downfall. "I believe this belongs to your evidence collection now." Agent Chen accepted the hairpin with the reverence of someone who understood its significance. The simple titanium alloy accessory looked innocuous in her palm, But Elena knew it contained enough evidence to destroy not just Marcus Kellerman, but the entire network of accomplices, enablers, and co-conspirators who'd profited from his systematic theft. "Your father was remarkably thorough in his documentation," Agent Chen observed, studying the hairpin's elegant design. "Rosa tells me he embedded multiple fail-safes and verification systems to prevent this evidence from being suppressed or destroyed." Elena felt another surge of pride in Eduardo's paranoid brilliance. Her father had been so traumatized by Marcus's initial theft that he'd spent his final years building an evidence preservation system that was virtually impossible to corrupt or compromise. Every recording, every document, every piece of proof had been encrypted, distributed, and protected with the same obsessive attention to detail that had made Eduardo such a gifted engineer. "He always said that truth was like energy," Elena replied, watching paramedics tend to Marcus in the back of the federal vehicle. "It couldn't be created or destroyed, only transformed. He made sure his truth would survive even if he couldn't." Agent Rodriguez joined them, his notepad already filled with preliminary statements and observations that would form the foundation of the federal case against Marcus. Elena could see the satisfaction in his expression, the particular pleasure that law enforcement professionals felt when a long-term investigation finally produced the arrest they'd been building toward for years. "Ms. Vasquez, we're going to need you to provide a formal statement about your interactions with Mr. Kellerman today," Agent Rodriguez explained. "Everything he said, every admission he made, every detail you can remember. His attorney is already preparing to claim entrapment or illegal surveillance, so we need to establish that this was a legitimate business interaction that revealed evidence of ongoing criminal activity." Elena nodded, understanding that her role in the investigation was far from over. Marcus's arrest was just the beginning of a legal process that would require her to testify about her father's work, explain the technical details of the stolen patents, and help prosecutors demonstrate the human cost of corporate intellectual property theft. Across the street, local news crews were beginning to arrive, their vehicles creating a media circus around what had started as a simple car repair. Elena could see reporters positioning themselves to capture the perfect shot of Marcus being transported to federal custody, their cameras hungry for images that would illustrate the fall of a celebrated tech mogul. The story was already spreading through social media and financial news networks. Kellerman Technologies was trending on Twitter, with speculation ranging from securities fraud to industrial espionage. Stock prices were plummeting in after-hours trading as investors tried to assess the scope of a scandal that could potentially invalidate the company's entire patent portfolio. Elena's phone buzzed with a call from Rosa Martinez, her mentor's voice crackling with excitement and exhaustion after years of building toward this moment. "Mia, are you watching the news?" Rosa asked, her words tumbling over each other with the intensity of someone who'd been waiting 15 years to speak freely about crimes she'd been forced to observe in silence. "They're calling it the biggest intellectual property scandal in tech industry history." Elena glanced at the reporters, setting up their equipment, already framing narratives about corporate greed and systemic corruption that would dominate news cycles for weeks to come. "It feels strange seeing it on television, like it's happening to someone else." "Your father would be so proud," Rosa continued, her voice thick with emotion that had been suppressed for over a decade. "Every prediction he made about Marcus, every warning he tried to give people, it's all being vindicated. The whole world is finally seeing what kind of man really built Kellerman Technologies." Through her garage window, Elena could see federal agents processing Marcus's Ferrari as evidence, photographing every detail and preparing to transport it to a government facility where forensic accountants would examine its computer systems for additional proof of stolen technology. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same car Marcus had used to demonstrate his wealth and success would now serve as evidence of the crimes that had made that wealth possible. Victor Chen was still on his phone, his conversation growing increasingly heated as he tried to negotiate with federal prosecutors who held overwhelming evidence and had no incentive to offer favorable plea agreements. Elena could hear fragments of his side of the conversation. Desperate appeals to prosecutorial discretion, frantic arguments about cooperation and restitution, increasingly panicked references to Miranda rights and constitutional protections. "The media wants to interview you," Agent Chen mentioned, nodding toward the growing crowd of journalists, "but we'd recommend waiting until after your formal statement is complete. Anything you say publicly could potentially be used by defense attorneys to challenge your testimony." Elena considered this advice while watching Marcus's transport vehicle disappear into traffic, carrying its cargo toward a federal holding facility where the man who'd destroyed her father would spend the first night of what would likely be a very long prison sentence. The media attention was flattering, but Elena had learned from her father's example that public vindication was less important than private justice. "I think I'll focus on fixing cars for now," Elena decided, turning back toward Mrs. Rodriguez's Honda. "The legal system can handle Marcus Kellerman. I have real work to do." Agent Rodriguez smiled at this response, recognizing the same understated competence that had allowed Elena to engineer Marcus's downfall with such devastating effectiveness. "We'll be in touch soon to schedule your statement. In the meantime, you might want to consider changing your locks and upgrading your security systems. Men like Kellerman usually have friends who don't appreciate being exposed." Elena nodded, understanding that Marcus's arrest was just the beginning of a process that would likely make her a target for retaliation from other criminals who'd profited from his network of stolen innovations. But she'd spent her entire life being underestimated by powerful men who assumed that quiet competence was the same thing as helplessness. Like this video and subscribe to our channel to see how justice finally catches up with those who think wealth makes them untouchable. The next chapter reveals the full scope of the legal earthquake Elena has unleashed. As the federal agents departed and the media circus moved on to follow Marcus's transport, Elena returned to her work with the calm satisfaction of someone who'd just completed the most important repair of her career. Mrs. Rodriguez's Honda still needed its transmission mount replaced. Diego still needed his medical treatments, and the garage still needed to be saved from foreclosure. But for the first time in 15 years, Elena Vasquez was working in a world where justice was possible, where truth could triumph over money, and where her father's legacy lived on in every properly diagnosed problem and perfectly executed solution. The hairpin was gone, its evidence delivered to those who could use it most effectively. But its real power, the knowledge and determination it represented, remained safely stored in Elena's heart, ready to be deployed against the next Marcus Kellerman who dared to underestimate the daughter of Eduardo Vasquez. 6 weeks after Marcus Kellerman's arrest, the federal courthouse in downtown San Francisco hummed with the controlled chaos of the largest white-collar criminal prosecution in the district's history. Elena sat in the witness preparation room, reviewing technical documents with Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen, while outside the building, protesters held signs demanding justice for the dozens of inventors whose lives had been destroyed by systematic patent theft. The case had grown exponentially since Marcus's initial arrest. What began as an investigation into Eduardo Vasquez's stolen engine management technology had metastasized into a RICO prosecution encompassing 43 victims, hundreds of millions in stolen intellectual property, and a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Silicon Valley's venture capital ecosystem. The defense is going to argue that your father willingly signed over his patents as part of a legitimate consulting agreement, Agent Chen explained, spreading Eduardo's original designs across the conference table like sacred texts. We need you to walk the jury through the technical specifications and explain how impossible it would have been for Marcus to develop this technology independently. Elena studied her father's blueprints with the reverence of someone examining religious artifacts. Every line, every calculation, every innovative solution bore Eduardo's distinctive engineering philosophy, the elegant simplicity that could only come from genuine understanding rather than corporate reverse engineering. Marcus's legal team would try to convince 12 ordinary citizens that this level of innovation could be replicated by committee, but Elena knew that genius left fingerprints that couldn't be forged. The engine management algorithm alone required insights that wouldn't become standard industry practice for another 5 years, Elena observed, pointing to sections of code that demonstrated her father's prescient understanding of hybrid technology. Marcus's team was still working with combustion engine optimization when my father was already solving problems they didn't know existed. The prosecution's case had been strengthened immeasurably by the testimony of other victims who'd found the courage to come forward after Marcus's arrest. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, whose battery technology powered half the electric vehicles on American roads, testified that Kellerman Technologies had stolen her innovations through the same consulting contract fraud that had destroyed Eduardo. Robert Kim, a software engineer whose app development frameworks had generated billions in revenue, provided evidence of intellectual property theft that followed the identical pattern Marcus had used for over a decade. Elena's phone buzzed with another interview request from 60 Minutes, the fourth major media outlet to contact her this week. The story had captured public imagination with its David versus Goliath narrative, but Elena remained focused on the technical details that would ensure Marcus's conviction rather than the publicity that might boost her garage's business. Ms. Vasquez, a court clerk announced, entering the preparation room with the formal bearing of someone accustomed to delivering important news. Judge Morrison would like to see you in chambers before tomorrow's testimony. Elena followed the clerk through corridors lined with portraits of federal judges who'd presided over landmark cases spanning decades of American jurisprudence. Judge Helen Morrison had a reputation for running efficient courtrooms and delivering sentences that reflected the full weight of federal law, particularly in cases involving crimes against working-class victims. Judge Morrison's chambers were a study in understated authority. Law books reaching from floor to ceiling, framed photographs of significant legal moments, and a desk that had witnessed countless decisions affecting the lives of defendants and victims alike. The judge herself was a woman in her early 60s who'd built her career prosecuting organized crime before ascending to the federal bench. "Ms. Vasquez, please have a seat," Judge Morrison said, gesturing to a leather chair positioned across from her massive desk. "I wanted to speak with you privately before you testify tomorrow, not about your testimony itself, but about what happens afterward." Elena settled into the chair, noting how the judge's office felt both intimidating and protective, like sitting inside the machinery of justice itself. Through the windows, she could see protesters still gathered outside the courthouse, their signs demanding accountability for corporate criminals who'd operated with impunity for too long. "Your testimony is going to be crucial to this prosecution," Judge Morrison continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen thousands of cases and understood which ones would define legal precedent. "But I want you to understand that convicting Marcus Kellerman is just the beginning of a much larger cleanup process." The judge pulled out a thick folder labeled Kellerman Technologies, Asset Recovery, its contents representing months of forensic accounting work designed to trace every dollar that had been generated through stolen intellectual property. Elena could see spreadsheets, bank records, and financial analyses that painted a comprehensive picture of how patent theft had been systematized into a business model. We've identified over $2 billion in revenue that can be directly traced to stolen patents, Judge Morrison explained, opening the folder to reveal charts that looked like Eduardo's engineering diagrams but described money flows instead of mechanical systems. The challenge is returning that money to its rightful owners while ensuring that legitimate employees and investors aren't destroyed in the process. Elena thought about the hundreds of engineers, programmers, and support staff who'd worked for Kellerman Technologies without knowing their salaries were paid with blood money extracted from destroyed inventors. Many of them were genuinely talented people who'd contributed real value to projects that happened to be built on stolen foundations. What happens to them? Elena asked, studying organizational charts that showed how deeply the theft had penetrated into every aspect of Marcus's business empire. That depends partly on your testimony, Judge Morrison replied. If we can establish clear criminal intent and systematic fraud, we can structure the asset recovery to protect innocent employees while ensuring maximum restitution for victims. But if the defense successfully argues that this was simply aggressive business practice rather than criminal enterprise, the remedies become much more limited. Elena understood the stakes. Her technical testimony would determine not just Marcus's prison sentence, but the financial future of dozens of inventors who'd been systematically robbed and the hundreds of employees who'd unknowingly participated in that robbery. The precision required was similar to diagnosing a complex mechanical problem. Every detail mattered, every connection had to be proven, and one missed specification could compromise the entire repair. "I'll be ready," Elena assured the judge, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with serving as the voice for her father and all the other victims who'd been silenced by Marcus's legal warfare. Judge Morrison nodded, closing the folder with the satisfied expression of someone who'd seen enough evidence to know how the case would end. "Ms. Vasquez, in my 30 years on this bench, I've learned that the most powerful testimony comes from witnesses who understand that justice is a technical process, requiring the same precision as engineering. Your father would be proud of the case you've helped build." Elena left the courthouse feeling the familiar calm that preceded complex mechanical work. Tomorrow, she would take the witness stand and explain to 12 jurors how Marcus Kellerman had stolen not just patents, but dreams, not just technology, but the hope that honest work could be rewarded with honest success. Rosa Martinez was waiting in the courthouse lobby, her arms full of additional evidence files that continued to arrive as more victims found the courage to come forward. At 67, Rosa had finally achieved the vindication she'd been seeking since Eduardo's suicide, but Elena could see the exhaustion in her mentor's eyes, the accumulated weight of fighting powerful criminals for longer than most people's entire careers. "Channel 7 wants to interview us together," Rosa mentioned, nodding toward news crews setting up outside the courthouse steps. "They're calling it the women who brought down big tech's biggest fraud." Elena considered this request while watching federal marshals escort another Kellerman Technologies executive into the courthouse for questioning. The media attention was gratifying, but she'd learned from her father's example that the most important victories were measured in restored justice rather than public recognition. "Let's finish the legal work first," Elena decided. "The interviews can wait until Marcus is in prison and every victim has been compensated." Rosa smiled with the fierce satisfaction of an attorney who'd found the perfect co-counsel. "Your father taught you well, mija. Justice first, publicity later. Like this video and subscribe to our channel to see how one woman's technical expertise brings down an entire criminal empire. The final chapter reveals Marcus's ultimate fate and Elena's triumphant return to the work that really matters. Outside the courthouse, protesters continued their vigil while inside, federal prosecutors prepared to dismantle the largest intellectual property theft ring in American history. Elena returned to her hotel room to review her testimony one final time, knowing that tomorrow she would speak for every inventor who'd ever trusted the wrong person, every dreamer who'd been destroyed by systematic greed, and especially for Eduardo Vasquez, whose paranoid documentation had finally achieved the justice he died believing was impossible. The hairpin was evidence now, locked in a federal facility and tagged for use in future prosecutions. But its real power lived on in Elena's hands, in Rosa's legal expertise, and in the precedent they were establishing for holding corporate criminals accountable regardless of their wealth or influence. The cleanup was almost complete, and justice was finally being served at the temperature Eduardo Vasquez had always preferred: cold, precise, and absolutely devastating to those who'd underestimated the power of truth preserved with engineering perfection. 18 months after Marcus Kellerman's Ferrari had died outside Elena's garage, the man who'd built an empire on stolen dreams sat in federal prison orange, his hands clasped in front of him as Judge Morrison prepared to deliver the sentence that would define the rest of his life. Elena watched from the gallery, surrounded by 42 other victims whose innovations had been systematically plundered by the defendant's criminal enterprise. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on closed-circuit television in adjacent chambers. Financial journalists filled the press section, their laptops ready to transmit news of the sentence to markets that had been anticipating this moment since Kellerman Technologies' stock price had collapsed following Marcus's arrest. Outside, protesters maintained their vigil with signs demanding maximum punishment for corporate criminals who'd operated with impunity for too long. "Mr. Kellerman," Judge Morrison began, her voice carrying the accumulated weight of months of testimony, evidence, and legal arguments that had laid bare the scope of his systematic theft. "The jury has found you guilty on all 47 counts of wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and racketeering under the RICO statute." Elena felt her father's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder as she listened to the litany of convictions that represented justice for Eduardo and every other inventor whose dreams had been stolen. The technical testimony she'd provided had been crucial in establishing Marcus's criminal intent, her engineering expertise translating complex patent theft into language that 12 ordinary citizens could understand and condemn. The prosecution's case had been overwhelming. Rosa Martinez had orchestrated a legal symphony that combined Elena's technical evidence with financial forensics, victim testimony, and Marcus's own recorded confessions into an unbreakable chain of proof. Defense attorney Victor Chen had tried every procedural challenge and alternative theory available to high-priced legal representation, but no amount of expensive advocacy could explain away recordings of Marcus celebrating Eduardo's suicide as a business opportunity. "The evidence presented during this trial," Judge Morrison continued, "demonstrates a pattern of criminal behavior spanning over 15 years, involving systematic theft of intellectual property from vulnerable inventors who trusted the defendant's promises of legitimate business partnerships." Marcus stared straight ahead with the hollow expression of a man who'd finally been forced to confront the human cost of his predatory business model. The narcissistic arrogance that had defined his public persona had been stripped away through months of testimony that revealed him as something far more pathetic than a criminal mastiff, a mediocre mind that had mistaken theft for innovation and cruelty for business acumen. Elena thought about the dozens of victims who testified during the trial, each telling a similar story of trust betrayed and dreams destroyed. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, whose battery technology patents had been stolen just months before her daughter's cancer diagnosis, leaving her unable to afford experimental treatments. Robert Kim, whose software innovations had been appropriated after he'd shared them in confidence during what he believed were legitimate business discussions. Maria Santos, whose revolutionary solar panel designs had been lifted from her dissertation research through a fake academic collaboration. The defendant's crimes were not victimless financial transactions, Judge Morrison observed, consulting notes that documented the human toll of Marcus's systematic theft. They involved the deliberate destruction of innovation communities, the suppression of technological advancement, and the personal devastation of inventors whose life's work was stolen and rebranded as corporate achievement. The financial restitution phase of the case had been almost as complex as the criminal trial itself. Federal accountants had traced over $3 billion in revenue to stolen intellectual property, requiring sophisticated asset recovery procedures that dismantled Marcus's business empire piece by piece. Kellerman Technologies had been dissolved, its legitimate assets distributed to victims, while its leadership faced criminal prosecution for their roles in the conspiracy. Elena's share of the restitution would be substantial, enough to save her garage, pay for Diego's medical treatments, and establish the Eduardo Vasquez Foundation for Independent Inventors that would provide legal protection for future innovators. But the money felt secondary to the vindication of watching Marcus finally held accountable for crimes that had gone unpunished for far too long. "Mr. Kellerman, please rise for sentencing," Judge Morrison commanded, her voice carrying the finality of federal justice delivered with mathematical precision. Marcus stood slowly, his expensive suit replaced by prison clothing that made him look ordinary, unremarkable, like any other criminal facing the consequences of his choices. Victor Chen rose beside his client, his confident demeanor replaced by the resignation of an attorney who'd exhausted every possible legal strategy without finding a path to redemption. "Taking into account the scope of your crimes, the number of victims, the calculated nature of your criminal enterprise, and your complete lack of remorse throughout these proceedings," Judge Morrison announced, "this court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release." Elena felt a profound sense of completion as the sentence echoed through the courtroom, its weight carrying the accumulated justice that Eduardo Vasquez had died believing was impossible. 25 years would make Marcus an old man when he finally emerged from prison, his stolen fortune forfeited and his reputation destroyed beyond any possibility of rehabilitation. "Furthermore," Judge Morrison continued, "you are ordered to pay full restitution in the amount of $3.2 billion, representing the total value of stolen intellectual property plus damages for the economic harm caused to victims and their families." The restitution order was largely symbolic. Marcus's assets had already been seized and distributed through the criminal forfeiture process. But the judge's explicit acknowledgement that his crimes had caused measurable financial harm established legal precedent that would protect future victims of corporate intellectual property theft. Victor Chen made a brief statement about appealing the sentence, but Elena could see in his expression that he understood the futility of challenging a conviction supported by overwhelming evidence and Marcus's own recorded confessions. The appeals process would likely take years and cost millions in legal fees, but it wouldn't change the fundamental reality that Marcus Kellerman had been exposed as a systematic criminal whose empire was built on other people's stolen work. As court adjourned and Marcus was led away to begin serving his sentence, Elena felt the particular satisfaction that came with completing a complex repair under challenging conditions. Every component of the case had functioned exactly as designed, every piece of evidence had performed its intended role, and the final result was a perfect restoration of justice that had been broken for far too long. Rosa Martinez approached with tears in her eyes and a smile that had been waiting 15 years to appear. "Your father would be so proud, mija. We did it. We actually did it." Elena hugged her mentor, feeling the weight of accumulated grief finally lifting from shoulders that had carried it since childhood. "He knew we would. That's why he preserved all that evidence. He was building this moment even when he couldn't see it coming. Outside the courthouse, Elena faced a crowd of reporters, eager for statements about the historic conviction and her role in bringing down one of Silicon Valley's most celebrated figures. But instead of seeking publicity, Elena found herself thinking about Mrs. Rodriguez's Honda, which was probably ready for another oil change, and Diego's physical therapy appointment later that week, and the dozen other cars waiting in her garage for the kind of honest repair work that didn't require federal investigations or criminal prosecutions. "Ms. Vasquez," a reporter called out, "how does it feel to know that your father's work finally received the recognition it deserved?" Elena considered this question while studying the protesters who'd maintained their vigil throughout the trial, ordinary people who'd traveled from across the country to witness justice for crimes that had affected entire communities of inventors and innovators. "My father always said that good work speaks for itself," Elena replied, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who'd learned that truth was more powerful than money when properly documented and precisely applied. It just took the right people listening at the right time. Like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories where patience, precision, and preparation triumph over wealth and corruption. Sometimes the best revenge is simply ensuring that justice is served at exactly the right temperature, cold, complete and devastating to those who thought they were untouchable. Elena drove back to her garage through neighborhoods that were beginning to recover from the gentrification pressure that had threatened to destroy them. The collapse of Kellerman Technologies had eliminated the driving force behind several redevelopment projects, allowing communities to preserve their character while benefiting from investment in local businesses and infrastructure. Her garage was exactly as she'd left it, fluorescent lights flickering over tools that had been passed down through generations, the familiar smell of motor oil and honest work, the sound of engines being diagnosed and repaired with the kind of competence that couldn't be stolen or replicated. Mrs. Rodriguez's Honda was parked in the bay, waiting for its scheduled maintenance, a reminder that the most important victories were often measured in problems solved rather than enemies defeated. Elena pulled the new hairpin from her hair, a simple titanium alloy accessory that looked exactly like her father's original design, but contained only styling tools rather than evidence of corporate crimes. She'd had it crafted by the same machinist who'd helped Eduardo create his masterpiece, a reminder that innovation continued even after justice had been served. The phone rang with another interview request, but Elena let it go to voicemail. Tomorrow, there would be more cars to fix, more problems to solve, and more honest work to be done in a world where truth had finally proven more powerful than stolen money. Marcus Kellerman would spend the next quarter-century in federal prison, learning that wealth built on other people's stolen dreams eventually crumbled under the weight of accumulated justice. Elena Vasquez would spend those same years doing what Eduardo had trained her to do, fixing things that were broken, solving problems that others couldn't understand, and proving every day that competence combined with integrity was the most powerful force in any economy. In the end, that was the real verdict. Fuck around with other people's life's work, and find out that some daughters never forget, never forgive, and never stop building the case that will eventually destroy you. Justice had been served with engineering precision, and Elena Vasquez was finally free to return to the honest work that had always been her true calling.